The BSides NoVA 2020 stream will begin.
Sounds good. Sounds like I'm coming across all right. Thank you all for your patience while I get set up. All right, ready to go? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Shapiro. I'm on Twitter as @GentlemanGuardian. Mind the spelling there at the beginning. No vowels. Thank you, Twitter, for your user character limit. I'm project manager at Jacobs Critical Mission Solutions. I'm part of specifically the cyber group and the federal and civilian and commercial group there. And this is my talk on democratizing intelligence, promises, and pitfalls. The goals of this presentation overall, there's a couple of core concepts of intelligence that I want to just familiarize everyone with so that we're all speaking the same language and kind of understand where I'm going here. I want to kind of talk about a general understanding of how technology is lowering the barrier to certain intelligence capabilities that kind of used to be nation state only, but maybe aren't so much anymore. I'm going to kind of do not a full demonstration, but talk about how these capabilities can be applied by average people these days, and some of the concerns and complications of playing in this space, not just as far as coming up with bad intelligence conclusions, but also like, you know, what this could mean to you personally if things go particularly badly. I'm going to have to work through the obligatory disclaimers, of course. I mentioned that I did work for Jacobs before, but this is not an official Jacobs talk, right? I don't represent the opinions of my employer. When I'm talking here, it's just me spitballing some crazy ideas I came up with. I'm also not necessarily advocating you start your own mini CIA. I'm just kind of informing you that it's possible. And when in doubt, if there's anything that you're interested in trying or any kind of avenues you want to follow up on, talk to a lawyer, which I am not. And even if I were, I'm not your lawyer. So with those kind of out of the way, while we're talking about who I'm not a cyber guy, right? Like, I don't have any CVEs or bug bounties to my name. I've never gotten root in a box. I really don't own a hoodie either. I do own a balaclava, though, so I guess I might be that guy on the left. I don't know. I'm also not an intel guy. I've never formally worked for the DoD or law enforcement or any of the big letter agencies. I have been told before that I radiate big Fed energy. I don't know that I necessarily believed it, but a random stranger in Whataburger in Vegas in DEF CON 18 used those words specifically. Are there any intelligence officers in the room? Good. Like, it's kind of a test, right? In all seriousness, though, if you are like an active part of the intel community, or you were an active part of the intel community, and you take umbrage with some of the stuff I'm kind of putting out here, right? Like, come talk to me afterwards, after we're done, right? Because I'm not a pro. But this is just what I see, and while I am taking courses in intelligence management through UMUC at the moment, right? I'm not a lifer, so set me straight if you don't like what I'm coming at you with, if I'm sacrificing some of your sacred cows. Who I am is a longtime computer and tech enthusiast, right? That's me in front of the Apple II in '83. If you looked at my bio in the digital breakdown that went out, the digital agenda, you'll see that I got a very diverse background, some time in physical security, close protection, executive protection down in Atlanta. I've done software QA, I've done instructional design and corporate training, I've done just a whole bunch of stuff. I kind of have a nice broad T at the top with like a particular area that I feel I'm specialized in and that I like to call capability development. I'm good at looking at the Lego pieces and seeing how they snap together, even if I'm not necessarily the guy to snap them together. I can kind of see how they do come together. And why this matters is because this is what I'm seeing as somebody who's not a pro, right? What is available is something that anybody with a sufficiently flexible and creative mind could figure out how to take care of on their own. Special training and special kind of tradecraft, while helpful, is no longer really kind of functionally required in order to start playing in the Intel space. I'm sorry. Deviant, back at Wild West Hacking Fest, I want to say last year, a couple years ago, time is mutable to me. He talks about the 10-80-10 rule, right? Where you've got your top 10% and your bottom 10%, and everybody else in between is the 80. And for our purposes, right, we've got our top 10%, right? We've got our letter agencies, NSA, CIA, foreign intel groups, right? Things like that. And we've got like our bottom 10%, who are, you know, folks who are political operatives who stand up very hasty accusatory references to potential political candidates and then have their operations tracked back literally to their mother's phone numbers. But for all intents and purposes, as long as you're operating in that middle 80%, right, for whatever purpose you're standing up your little mini intel shop, you're golden, right? You're good enough to achieve your goals. So don't let the notion that you've got to be, you know, operating at the level of these, you know, elite tier intel agencies kind of keep you from exploring the space a little bit. So we're going to talk about intelligence, but what is intelligence? I borrowed this obviously from the FBI's website. Simply defined, intelligence is information relevant to decision making. That's very, very broad, but it's also relevant because what is intelligence in one scope is noise in another. And this is actually kind of one of the things that was brought up in the September 11th, you know, post-September 11th reports, was a discussion about how there were several kind of puzzle pieces that, you know, this group considered it intelligence and this puzzle piece over here was considered noise by this silo and vice versa, right? There wasn't enough overarching communication to be able to assemble these things because each of the agencies was so siloed, and that's what got us into the office of the Director of the National Intelligence and things like that, right? You needed somebody to be able to go, no, these actually do come together, right? When you're operating at that top 10%, you kind of need that. But for our purposes, right, like if we're talking about intelligence on a civilian scale, it's just whatever information you need in order to be able to make a functionally important decision. So this might be familiar to some of y'all. This is the intelligence cycle. We'll come back and reference this a couple of times. I just want to kind of put it up so folks kind of see it and understand that, you know, in a general way, intelligence operates in this cycle when you're looking at a prolonged operation. We'll discuss each of these kind of areas in a little bit more detail a little bit later and discuss what the difference is between, say, like a pen test or a red team operation versus something that's a little bit more prolonged, like a real intel setup. So we're going to first have a little bit of a history lesson. I want to walk through, side by side, kind of the advancement of technology and computing technology juxtaposed with the advancement of intelligence as a concept, as an institution, not just at the nation state level, but kind of in the West. We're going to start off in the early 20th century. Here we're starting to see the beginning of like kind of real SIGINT, right? During World War I, with Marconi's telegraph over there on the left, groups that are doing intelligence work figure out kind of how to intercept and decrypt telegraph messages that are being sent back and forth between assets in the seas. this interception, while technical in nature, the decryption is still kind of essentially done by hand, right? There's a guy listening in, and he's got to like jot down what's being said, and then he's got to like hand it to a dude who's kind of responsible for figuring out the patterns and making it happen, right? There's no computer helping them out. But from a technical capabilities perspective, this is where you kind of start to see the first use of technical collection in this respect. You've got, on the computer tech side, over here on the right, you've got the first kind of single-use, purpose-built electromechanical devices are put out. IBM builds a punch card-based tabulating machine to help with the 1890s census, and it's essentially just a really big calculator, right? It requires a room full of ladies sorting punch cards to get results out of. There's no kind of direct applicability to intelligence analysis at either an operational or a strategic level at this point. It's a great big calculator that takes up a room full of heavy-duty resources. Moving into World War II and that kind of time period, right? SIGINT starts playing a more vital role here. Everybody's kind of familiar with Bletchley Park and the Enigma and Ultra efforts, right? The efforts to crack the Enigma code. Slightly less well known, but also just as important, the MAGIC efforts, which were the US's efforts to try to break Japanese code breaking. You kind of start getting a more, based on their efforts to do that, you start getting a more institutionalized view of strategic intelligence. You have the formal formation of the OSS, which is designed to kind of coordinate across all of the various branches of the military, whatever they pick up, and kind of act as the governing body for all intelligence through that. About this time in technology in 1943, you've got the Mark I Colossus, which is actually pictured over there on the left. Again, you can see women in computing, right, tending to it and helping to keep it operating. These were computers that were 1,500 vacuum tube computers. There were a series of 10 of them, and they were designed to facilitate Enigma code breaking. That's literally all they did. They were a single purpose machine, more strategically applied this time, but specifically done with the intent to help crack the Enigma codes. In 1944, you also have the Harvard Mark I, which is technically the second program-controlled machine. Konrad Zuse out in Germany was the first one to come up with an operational programmable computer, and was the Z3. That was in 1941, but we weren't going to let him get away with that, so we destroyed it. We bombed it. So the US has the first that survived the war. The Mark I was 51 feet long. It weighed 5 tons, had 750,000 parts, 72 accumulators, and it was essentially built to calculate a 23-digit number with a plus or a minus sign. And the Navy used it to help set up its ballistics tables to ensure more accurate fire from its cannons. And this is one of the first occasions where you see computing technology being used for at least tactical operational purposes. There's still somewhat relatively single-purpose machines, though. World War II through the first half of the Cold War. This is the Cold War and nuclear-related espionage is really the prime kind of environment for intelligence-driven developments in computing technology. The resource cost for computing technology still very high in many terms, both in terms of space, energy, heat, and human resources. You have Whirlwind in 1951. It was the first interactive computer with a keyboard and a cathode ray tube. That technology, which was designed to do weather monitoring, would later become SAGE, which is what's pictured here, the semi-automatic ground environment, a system of real-time computers designed to warn against air attacks. It served as the backbone for NORAD's early interception until the 80s. It was based on IBM's ANFSQ7 platform, 60,000 vacuum tubes, 250 tons, used 3 megawatts of electricity and performed 75,000 instructions a second. As technology continues to progress, we get the first supercomputer, the Cray over there on the left, the Cray 1, installed at Oak Ridge National Laboratories. You also start to see in businesses the adoption of what are called decision support systems. And very large businesses or very large operations that are responsible for industrial kinds of control programs and things like that that would normally require a very heavy personal overhead to make decisions, will begin using computers to try to remove the human element from that and try to make decisions based on the data that the computers are giving them. This is essentially the beginning of what would later be called business intelligence. But it's also, at this time, we have the evolution of true institutionalized intelligence, right, with the OSS turning into the CIA under Allen Dulles, the FBI conducting domestic intelligence gathering under Hoover. A lot of that effort obviously directed towards Russia and its various proxies. Towards the end of this time period, computing technology got into a kind of a negative light in some of the Intel community based on the fact that it was kind of misapplied in decision-making processes regarding the Vietnam War. And so there sort of institutionally within the United States intelligence community became a general distrust of computer and technology-based intelligence-related work. It was kind of generally decided that humans were better at this and to put computers on the back shelf for a while. We'll see why this is relevant next. As we come into the late 20th century and computing technology begins to help get more miniaturized, you start to see personal computers at home, but it's still not terribly advanced, right? Big institutional spenders are getting more bang for their buck with server-class computing. You're starting to see the beginning of the World Wide Web. From an espionage perspective, we're coming up towards the end of the Cold War. As the Cold War ends, we're starting to see the development of other intelligence, that's right, other intelligence-related capabilities and kind of an overall broadening of theaters of operation. Right now that we no longer have to focus on Russia, we can kind of start shopping around a little bit, like where are we going next, guys? What are we working on next? And the intelligence community, though, is still kind of gun-shy about using computing tech to do intel work in lieu of well-trained humans. The concept of business intelligence, though, continues to gain traction, and it's formally coined in 1989. A lot of the work that companies are doing at this point has caught up in terms of scope with where the nation-state apparatuses are at, where you kind of have a strategic, self-looking, we're going to use technological aggregated intelligence to help us make better decisions internally, but not necessarily as much externally yet. I tried to find a graphic for business intelligence, but they were so bad. They were just so bad. The early 21st century, right? We see continued exponential growth in computing technology, cloud tech, the birth and the rise of big tech companies. I know technically Apple started back at the end of the 20th century or kind of in the middle period technically. But a lot of these, almost all these companies over there on the left made big pivots in the early 21st century that have solidified their place where they are now. More and more businesses and smaller institutions, as technology is being increasingly available to them, are finding ways to leverage business intelligence to make not only internal decisions, but also starting to look at ways where intelligence can help them make adversarial decisions against possible opponents, getting ahead of their opponents or doing things to thwart them or things like that. You have the rise of private intelligence firms, often sponsored by In-Q-Tel, right? Palantir comes to mind, as well as a couple of others. Government looks to them to kind of save costs with public-private partnerships and things like that. On a personal level, at about this time, we start seeing the advancement of the quantified self kind of concept, where human beings are sort of started to keep tabs on data on themselves, and what's my blood pressure, and how am I doing, how much sleep am I getting, these kinds of things. We're starting to see on an individual level a repeat of the cycles we've seen developed so far, where we have a single purpose. I have my Fitbit, and it helps me count my steps. Right? That's a specific computer that I'm using for that. In the same way that formal intelligence communities have been using it in the past. Nowadays, almost everybody has some kind of smartwatch, unless you're the type to stay away from them, which, given the audience here, is not entirely unlikely. When I talk about how companies are starting to use intelligence adversarially against each other, here's an example of kind of what I'm gesturing at in the first kind of 20 years of the 21st century. This headline is from the Canadian Broadcasting Company and AP. It's dated October 2nd, 2014. US security firm identified a mobile Trojan that was linked to several apps that were purported to be developed by protesters, Hong Kong protesters, to aid in organizing protests, right? So that's a legit headline from before. And if this may were to be determined to be true, one would expect to see a headline something like this, right? Report, secret program, China program spied on Hong Kong protesters, right? That would not be an unexpected headline to see. That's actually a word swap for a different headline that came out about the same time, which is, report, secret Uber program hell spied on Lyft drivers, right? So we're starting to see private entities engaging in intelligence operations against one another to a certain extent. Here's another example. France accuses Russia of spying on military from space. Right? Russian satellites getting a little too close to French satellites. France is worried that Russia is intercepting communications from them. Date on that, September 7th, 2018. Again, a reword. Russia used satellites to intercept communications of French military. If that above claim were proven true, that would be a reasonable headline one might expect to see when the truth of that was reported. This is the headline I word swapped it with. Boston Red Sox used Apple Watches to steal signs against Yankees. Right? In this particular case, they used an infield camera, and they monitored hand signals that the catcher was using, and they would relay from the video replay room down to the dugout via Apple Watch, and then the person in the dugout would make gestures or do something to try to get the attention of the batter so that they would have just a fraction of a second to know what pitch was coming down the pipe more than they would before. Just enough to give them that advantage. So where do we go from here, right? What's the road ahead? My position, my stance on that. My assertion is that this application of kind of adversarial intelligence by corporations, by private entities, and things like that against individuals and other entities in our current information environment, combined with the advancement of technology that we've kind of chronicled thus far, presents an opportunity for individuals to start doing their own little micro-intelligence operations, and that we may need to start doing these in the future, right? We may need, for our own well-being or the well-being of the people we care about, to kind of sit down and figure out how to navigate an environment where we're kind of being actively worked against from an intelligence capabilities perspective. Assuming one wants to take up this task, assuming one wants to kind of get involved in it, not that I'm necessarily advocating one does, but if you do, right, we're going to revisit the intelligence cycle. We're going to start at the 12 o'clock position at planning and direction and kind of move around the outside. Actually, technically, we're going to start in the middle with mission, because the first thing you've got to do is figure out what your mission is and what you care about. Right? You can't just start grabbing data and bulk collecting and going, well, I'll figure out what's important down the line, right? The first thing you got to do is figure out what the intent of your shop is. Because remember our definition from earlier, intelligence is information relevant to decision making. So what's your decision? Why are you doing what you're doing? What are you looking for? What problem are you solving? It doesn't have to be like a big deal, huge social justice thing. I actually stood up like a little mini Intel shop after the Soleimani strike, just because I noticed all my friends on Facebook were freaking out about World War III. And I was like, guys, just chill, right? Like, you guys trust me, you guys know I'm a reasonable researcher. Let me just help you get to sleep tonight, right? Sleep through the weekend, and we'll see where we stand on Monday. So I stood up a little thing. I queried the sources I had. I put together an analytical product, and I delivered it to them in a 4-paragraph post on Facebook, and then I shut down my shop and went to sleep for the night, right? But that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm gesturing at this, right? You need to pick your mission. Because that's going to define everything else that comes after it. Keep in mind that what's small for somebody else might be big for you or another person, right? If you're a targeted population, if you're a minority in a vulnerable area, and there's an uptick in distribution of hate literature there, and you decide that you want to stand up a shop, an intel shop, to kind of track down where the neo-Nazis are in your neighborhood, right? Like, maybe it's a small deal to someone like the NSA, but it's kind of a big deal to you, right? Like, your personal health and safety and well-being are kind of wrapped up in this. So don't necessarily feel like you got to have some grand social justice thing that you're aligned to. You certainly can, right, if you want to get involved in anti-corruption or anti-child trafficking or any of the other kind of broader social issues out there, like, absolutely feel free. You can stand up your own shop to support those efforts. But sometimes the most important missions are personal ones, right, like ensuring your own safety. So planning and direction, right, like that's the next, when you start from the 12 o'clock and you're moving around the cycle. Once you've defined your mission, you need to start figuring out your collection plans and the direction you want to go in. We return to the question of what's good enough, right? Remember that middle 80% rule. You don't need to be in the top 10%, but you certainly don't want to be in the bottom. You're going to want to define what level of effort you're willing to exert. You're going to want to start kind of getting into the weeds on your topic. Doing a little bit more general research to start with, not necessarily looking for answers yet, but looking for the right questions to ask. Right? If you've defined your mission and you're trying to set up planning and direction, start thinking about what questions drive what's behind your mission. This is the same kind of process for those of you who have done a lot of pen testing work, right? Whenever you're scoping out a new pen test engagement, right? This is not new, right? This is something you do right up front, right? And oftentimes you write it down so that you and the customer have a clear understanding of what the scope of your pen testing agreement is. When I used to do instructional design, we called this front-end analysis, right? Just kind of getting grips on what exactly we need to cover. Moving on to collection, right? We start with OSINT because why not? It's the most prevalent and has the general lowest barrier to entry. There are plenty of resources to teach you about OSINT, right? I'm not going to cover them here because you can like literally stumble across them on Twitter. There's people search engines and Google dorking and all sorts of other opportunities and resources that are available for you. If you want to spend money and spend a couple $1,000s and get it from the folks at Bellingcat, right? Like go to one of their 3-day intensive workshops and really like learn to be an OSINT pro. Okay, great. Otherwise, right? Like there's YouTube videos, right? There's Twitter feeds. You can get this stuff just about anywhere, right? You decide, again, your level of involvement, how much it matters to you, how much you want to get involved in the learning process for this. Don't underestimate the power of things like gray literature or FOIA requests, court or other public records, land deeds, various bits of obscure technical documentation, right? Things like that. They may not necessarily provide you with direct information, but they can often provide very important context. And depending on what your ostensible mission is, that can make the difference between something that kind of exists in the lower end of, well, this is useful, and wow, this was really good. It'll also, there are occasions where people start doing research and then they make a FOIA request on something that they're trying to figure out about, and they uncover a whole separate thing that they had no idea about, right? A whole avenue that was previously hidden opens up because of an improper redaction or, just because they weren't aware of it and official sources were relying on security through obscurity, right? The strategic Google dorking, things like that. My only caution with like gray literature and FOIA type stuff is that a lot of times, number one, some of it's free, but sometimes there's an associated cost, right? So you gotta pay. And number two, in some cases, the fact that you made these requests is logged. And in other cases, it is forcibly disclosed to the entities about which you are making requests. Yes, technically you can go down and request land plat diagrams for your neighbors at the courthouse, right? But I think once a month, at least in Virginia, I believe, once a month, there's kind of an audit of like, hey, here's all the people who requested information on your house. And if somebody's land shows up there, they get a notification, hey, somebody's looking into your house, right? Maybe you care, maybe you don't. But if you want to stay under the radar, consider that sometimes gray literature and FOIA requests have mandatory disclosures associated with them. Hardware hacking and technical ints, right? This is not necessarily limited to soft int related research. If you're concerned about water quality, groundwater quality in your town, or you're concerned about, various, air quality or pollution, or even if you just want to like capture image intelligence of somebody, you can build that, right? You can get a single board computer from any one of a number of suppliers and throw a couple hats on there, diagnostic hats. You see up there, I got a Geiger counter kit, right? Maybe radiation monitoring matters to you, right? Or the mission that you're up against. Nation states don't have the monopoly on that capability anymore. Are you going to be as good as a nation state who can like determine these kinds of things from space? No, absolutely not. But like, will you be good enough to attain your objective? Yeah, probably. I mean, unless your objective is unreasonable, like you're looking for, Doc Brown and his, radioactive isotopes that he stole from the Libyans to power his time machine, right? But the point is that from a technical perspective, if you're willing to, right, you can just build technical collectors. You can work them into wearables or portables. You can go to a library and use a 3D printer to make a decorative housing for it, and then spray paint that decorative housing so it looks like a common piece of furniture or a collectible item or something like that, and then sneak it on somebody's bookshelf, right? Like, depending on where you want to go with that. We'll kind of get into some of the possible pitfalls of approaches like that. But the point is, the capability exists, right? You can do it. And I'm not going to get into the technical details of how to do it, because there are, again, hundreds of talks and other presentations on that kind of thing. But don't let it intimidate you, right? You see the Pringles Yagi antenna down there, right? If it's stupid but it works, it's not stupid. You also don't have to build it on your own, right? If you're lazy or you're too busy or you're just unconfident in your skills, you can buy pre-built, right? You can go to Amazon and see what they've got, or eBay or Banggood or Alibaba if you don't care about getting it from the Chinese, right? I actually have here, I put a Band-Aid over it so that nobody can actually see out of the front of the camera, but this is a 720p 45-minute IR-enabled camera. Fit in the little auxiliary pocket of my jeans. It can be spray painted some color, it could be hidden or mounted anywhere. I got it for 40 bucks. I got it at the end cap of my grocery store, right? I didn't even have to go to a spy shop to get it. I was literally out shopping for food because I wanted to make sure I had a 2-week supply of food for the coronavirus. And we walked past the end cap and I was like, the cop cam, what's that? That'll go great with my talk, right? And so if you don't care about proprietariness, if you don't care about it necessarily being unique to you or being particularly well hidden because the people who you're trying to spy on are not that observant, right? Okay, sure, why not? Take the easy road. So we're starting to move out of collection and into processing a little bit, right? We're kind of in an area that spans the two. Groupware is a big thing, and fora, various forums and things like that. Discord, Slack, Keybase, group signal chats, right? There are probably dozens of private ones between people who are really pros at this and enjoy doing it in their spare time. I'm not a member of any of the super cool groups. But I have a couple of open, publicly facing Discords where folks who can kind of congregate, and they got bots that scrape Twitter for me, and they got a couple of foreign language experts and a couple of other imagery intelligence experts who are kind of on tap, and you can ping them in the Discord if, hey, Hezbollah just sent out this particular message, and I don't know what it is, it's in Arabic, I can't read it, right? Hey, so-and-so, get in here, help me understand what this thing says. That's available to you as a private civilian. Obviously you need to take what you get from it with a little bit of a grain of salt, right? Depending on the moderation level and how well you trust the people in these kinds of groups. There can be a very high noise level and a very high misinformation level. But again, right, what's good enough? You're not coordinating a drone strike, right? So it doesn't matter whether or not your translation is 100% accurate or you don't necessarily fully kind of understand the nuances of what's going on here, right? I'm just trying to help my friends get to sleep tonight, right? So, when Hezbollah made a statement about, how they were going to react in the wake of Soleimani's killing, right? The local Arabic guy got in there and this is my stance on it, and this is based on what I know of Hezbollah and how they phrase their threats, right? This is kind of my interpretation, and I really didn't have much choice. I kind of took him at his word. But there was a guy who could do that for me, right? I didn't have to handle that on my own because I was a member of a group like this. So consider it, again, whether or not your mission warrants that. If you're going to use these for collection purposes, try to get 2 or 3 sources and kind of cross-vet them. Don't necessarily, it came across the Discord, it absolutely has to be true. If you guys know of any others or have any others and you want to share them later, just come flag me down. As far as additional processing goes, right, if you're going to get into technical int stuff, you're possibly going to find yourself drowning in data pretty fast. We talked earlier about how the in the past, there were giant warehouses full of computers that were dedicated to single tasks, intercepting possible airborne traffic. Now we have giant warehouses full of computers that you can rent a slice of, right? Like you can get in there and you can have a fraction of that processing power, and you can use it to kind of help make sense of your Twitter graph, right? You can use it to decipher the connections between a possible disinformation network that you're kind of looking to tease apart. You don't have to be responsible for standing that up on your own if you're willing to make the investment. Analysis and production. As far as technical innovation goes, there's really not a lot to get into here, right? Like, you're always going to have to write it up. You always got to make it visible to the outside world. There are, again, plenty of other individual courses out there about good ways to present information. Facebook is constantly hitting me up to try to get into one of Tufte's classes on data visualization and things like that, because I'm a bit of a data scientist geek. I actually recommend the Analytic Writing Guide by Louis Kaiser and Randolph H. Fersen, who I have here. I got that downloaded in my Kindle. Anybody who's doing red team or other kind of Intel-y type work as a profession, or even avocationally, knows that while the fun part is the testing and the collection, the most important part's the write-up, right? If you can't convey your findings at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much fun you had pulling down those results. We're going to touch on this a little bit more during the Pitfalls section. And then lastly, dissemination and integration. And this is where we kind of draw the line between the one-off pen tests and persistent intelligence capabilities, right? Folks who have been doing or are doing pen tests, right? You set your scope, you do your work, you processed your findings, you wrote up your report, you delivered it to your customer, and then the engagement stops, right? Like, you're done unless you're part of an internal red team who will constantly kind of be testing the system. For an Intel shop, unless you're doing like a one-off, I'm going to help my friends get to sleep tonight kind of setup, right? If you're keeping tabs on hate groups or sex offenders in your neighborhood, right? Like, you are going to be required to take the information you learned from the last cycle you went through and kind of fold it back up and go, okay, well, how does this change my direction? Now that I know these things, what can I do? Where can I go from here? How does this change the direction I move? We don't, you don't want to kind of operate from the perspective of, oh, we identified all the members of a hate group in our local area. That's it, we're done. We've identified them. We're squared away. Pitfalls. Lack of formal analysis training, right? When you're doing this kind of thing, there are a whole slew of data interpretation and cognitive biases that can get in the way of being able to make an accurate report, even if it's just to your friends. If you don't want to end up in that bottom 10%, you need to kind of be familiar with the techniques that folks use to, kind of minimize the chances of those biases being an issue. 3 resources I recommend here. Tradecraft Primer, Structured Analytic Techniques for Improving Intelligence Analysis. That's available for free on the CIA's website, right? Like, you can literally just go to the CIA's website and download that. And maybe they track you, I don't know. But they're putting it out there. This is what their guys use to try to minimize cognitive bias. Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, Richard J. Hewer Jr., another resource. Used it a lot in my intelligence management classes. It is also available for free on the CIA's website. You can just download it and start reading. Don't mistake me, right? These are not great, fun bedtime reads. I mean, maybe they're great for bedtime because they'll put you to sleep. But, they're not terribly thrilling. If you want something that's a little bit more fun to read, Cases in Intelligence Analysis by Sarah Miller Beebe. Beebe? I don't know how to pronounce her name, and Randolph H. Fersen. That particular book is available on Amazon. I went ahead and downloaded that. That's a fun book to read when you're sitting next to a super beefy Russian dude who has a bald head and visible tattoos on a 4-hour plane flight to a security conference, when all he's doing is kind of giving you the side eye and browsing his V-contact profiles. That's a fun one to be looking through. But that book in particular goes through several previous intelligence cases and then applies structured analytical techniques to them. Some of them didn't have analytical techniques applied to them before and were kind of clusterfucks, right? So pardon my French, kind of a disaster area. And so some of them are retrospectives and going, right, if they had looked at these things, it wouldn't have been so bad. So, some resources for you there. And there are other ones out there, obviously, that are available. Another pitfall. Lack of knowledge of legal frameworks, right? Because you're not the NSA or the FBI or even your local police department, you don't get certain kinds of protections that they might for certain kinds of things. You don't have certain restrictions that they might, but you also don't get certain kinds of protections. When does your kind of efforts to try to keep tabs on members of your community who you feel are hazardous to you move out of the realm of this is something I'm doing for my protection and into this is when I'm stalking you, right? Like I made a mention earlier of putting a camera in somebody's house, right? Obviously, if you don't have permission to do that, right, you're breaking the law. I'm not, as I mentioned before, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to advise you on anything here, but talk to a lawyer, right? Like if this isn't just some kind of one-off thing that you're doing for yourself or your local friends for fun, if this is something that you really care about and you're planning on starting up your own little micro firm over, buy a couple hours of a lawyer's time so that you understand where the thresholds are and can protect yourself accordingly. Lack of institutional support, right? Like when things go sideways at the NSA or the CIA or something like that, there are a whole bunch of people who can protect them, right? They've got folks who can cover up mistakes or make backstories or even provide other kinds of logistical or monetary support. If you're flying solo, or even if it's just you and a couple of your friends, you don't have that flexibility, right? An operational setback could be the end of what you're working on, right? That could spell the closure of your shop. So, keeping in mind that you can kind of counter this by just being cognizant of this restriction, trying your best to apply whatever tradecraft practices you can manage, not overextending yourself. And, consider pop-up or guerrilla structures that can kind of be easily abandoned, well, got burned, I'm just gonna kind of leave this behind. And then what I like to call lack of anticipated consequence. I don't know if anybody here in the room was present for the 130 out in the other room over there, David Evanden's Jedi Mammoth, his 130 presentation about unintended consequences of working in an environment that he worked in was very severe for him. Again, right, he's an actor who was working with folks in the top 10%. So the level of consequence he faced was much higher. But if you decide child trafficking is something you want to follow up on, you're gonna see some things or learn about some things that maybe you didn't wish you knew now. And when you combine that with the lack of institutional support from our previous slide, right? They've got psychologists on staff to help them with PTSD, complex PTSD, and things like that. They've got folks who can quickly extract them if things go south and adversaries are starting to beat down their door. If you draw the wrong kind of attention to yourself by your local hate group because you're concerned about your well-being and you're just trying to keep tabs on them, and they decide they want to show up out in front of out in front of your house with trucks and torches, right? You're kind of on your own. And I don't want to overplay the significance of that or the likelihood of that happening. But from a personal perspective, I don't have a slide on this because I'm trying to be somewhat respectful, but from a personal perspective, there are two people in my life on different ends of the political spectrum who essentially were bullied into committing suicide as a result of either direct or indirect personal intelligence-related actions. One of them was doing investigation into the money trails behind certain kinds of campaign influence-related stuff back in 2016. And the level of bullying he received combined, both virtually and physically, combined with some underlying mental issues resulted in him taking his own life. On the flip side of that, the transgendered son of a friend of my family's was reported on in a local paper. The struggles of trying to go to school, just go to school, right? Get an education when you're in the process of transitioning as a kid. A local politician decided that they wanted to make a point and got into a polemic about it and got their base riled up. And their base decided to stand up a little intel firm, and they found out who that person was and bullied them successfully into first quitting school, and then he waited until he was at least an adult before he eventually went the same route and ended up taking his own life. So there are real consequences to these kinds of things, right? I don't want to say that it's automatic, but think about it, right? What are you getting into? What's the worst that could happen, really? And are you ready for that? Kind of sorry to end on that downer, but we have reached the end of my presentation. If you've got questions, if you've got beef with any of the stuff that I've brought up or said, and you want to set me straight, right? Like if you are an Intel lifer or you've got, some kind of issue, catch me outside. How about that? Otherwise, I guess I'll go ahead and what time we got here? 53. Yeah, I'll go ahead and vacate early so that folks have a chance to get set up and not feel rushed. And like I said, just talk to me, catch me out in the atrium somewhere if you want to chat. Thank you all for your time and your attention. I sincerely appreciate it.